This one is on so the foundations of intergroup conflict research, which is the Robbers Cave experiment. And this study was conducted in the 1950s and then published in the early 1960s. And it's kind of like Allport's work, just has laid the groundwork for a lot of research on this subject. So research was conducted by Muzafer Sherif, I think I'm saying that correctly, to answer these questions. How quickly can group identity be formed among strangers? How salient is this group identity for its members? What role does this group identity play when confronted with members of a competing group? And then how can intergroup conflict be mitigated? And so this is a complex study. It took the actual study took about a couple weeks or so, but had a lot of different elements to it. So some of the methods of this study were they had these 22 boys who were invited to a summer camp at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. And they weren't aware that this study was being taken place. They all came from very similar backgrounds. They were fifth graders going into sixth grade, 11 to 12 years old. They were from middle-class Protestant families. And they hadn't, and I think they're all white as well, and they had not met each other at all, but were invited to come and spend a couple weeks at Robbers Cave. And so the camp was set up, and the camp had two separate cabins, far enough distant from each other that you couldn't see them from each other, and they each had equal access to opportunities of camp amenities like swimming and boating and all that. And so before arriving to Robbers Cave, the boys were split up randomly into two groups, and then were separated into two cabins. They're unaware of the other group's existence at first, for about the first week or so. And so the experiment itself was broken up into three stages. The first stage focused on in-group formation, and the purpose was looking at how quickly, if a group would form and how quickly it would form and establish an in-group identity. And this was done through group bonding exercises, often meeting the boys or having the boys work together to do something or some sort of activity in order to win a prize for the group. Then the second stage was the friction phase, which was all about intergroup competition. And it occurred as the groups kind of slowly began to make contact with each other. And they had a bunch of these camp competitions set up. At the end of stage one, actually, they were able to glimpse very briefly each other's group. And eventually, without really provocation, they demanded a chance to compete against one another. And so just the existence of that group that spurred that need for competition. And so these competition activities included things like tug of war, baseball, tent pitching, and more. And then the winner of the tournament between the two groups would receive various prizes like a trophy and I think knives. They're giving out knives apparently, and a number of other things. And so this led into the third stage, which was the integration phase. And Sherif wanted to look at, how if intergroup conflict occurred and he kind of expected it to, how can we resolve that conflict? And he tried two different methods, one being contact theory. If the groups were given equal opportunity, equal footing and grounding to just interact with each other through various camp events, like going to see a movie together, would they suddenly start to interact with each other? And then through a second way, if they had superordinate common goals, if they were both working towards the same goal, would they start to interact with each other more positively? And the results of this were in the first stage, in group formation. Although group formation had been randomly assigned, by the end of the first week, each group had become very organized with established hierarchy and group norms. So you had high status members, low status members, established leaders. So this group identity became pretty salient, and it only became more salient as the friction phase began, when negative attitudes and behaviors formed towards each group member's respective outgroup. So in the first meeting between the boys, there was a bunch, which I think was baseball or something, a bunch of name calling occurred. And as the activities progressed during the time they were there, it escalated into greater intergroup conflict. And this escalated to a point of violence even. There was a point where each group destroyed each other's flags by burning them, by destroying them, tearing them apart. They broke into each other's cabins, they raided them, and then stole each other's belongings. And at one point, the two groups even met for a physical fight, but the camp staff intervened before that could occur because, you know, it's still a camp for boys. So this is a lot of times when people look at Robbers Cave, they see like, wow, look how fast and quick these boys didn't even know each other, and they have these arbitrary groups, but you know, they're able to get violent so fast. But then there comes the integration stage, and so first, Sherif attempted to simply like I mentioned, allow the boys the chance to interact with each other on equal ground. But when this happened, the boys refused to associate with each other, and except for when it came to like throwing things at each other across the room. So there was no association of groups. And so then they decided to impose a superordinate common goal through a number of activities. And one of these things was they had fixated the camp's water system to break at one point or just not stop working. And so the boys had to work together in order to figure out what the problem of the water system was, in order for the camp to get water, as they were becoming more and more dehydrated. So that's one example. There's one where there's a stalled truck and the boys needed to, you know, push it to go, and they needed everybody's help for that. So the boys began to work with each other to make these things, to complete these activities and work towards these common goals. And so after engaging in these tasks little by little, and the antagonism between the two groups lessened, and it didn't stop automatically. Like after the first activity, which I think was the water system repair, there's still a food fight occurred after that. So there's still some antagonism, but you know, little by little, as these activities got more and more, this degenerating behavior started to settle down. And by the very end of the camp, the group that won a certain activity prize even shared it with the other group. I think they were all sharing malts or something. And so what we can kind of learn from this, and what kind of Sherif took away from this, was he shared them optimistically, looking at things like showing that tools like superordinate common goals can be used to reconcile general intergroup conflicts, even though they can get more complex than a summer camp. But it also details, kind of like I mentioned earlier, just how quickly group identity can be formed and used to compete with and dehumanize other groups. So there's some hope there, and there's also reality that shows how easy it is for us to stay put in our group identities. So this is Robbers Cave.
Yeah, another foundational theory, or another foundational paper and research study. Yeah, I love this. This is a great study as a foundational piece. I mean, it's really promising. I think that he was able to show, and studies have since shown, that this sort of positive intergroup contact, meaning having a common goal, actually really does help reconcile differences, at least between these types of groups where we're talking a minimal group paradigm, like where you're just like, you know, a very brand new group with not a long history of trauma between them. And so the question is then, you know, you have these groups with a lot of trauma behind them, you know, violent trauma, violent conflict for many years. You know, how do you reconcile that? And the problem is, I think some of the research bears this out, is that even if you're on a path towards reconciliation, and you're doing things to help reconcile long-standing conflicts, like one instance that falls back into the old pattern can really break apart or shatter the progress you've made. So that's the tough thing, right? It's like, if you've got a long-standing conflict, it's going to be a long process of reconciliation, of sharing goals, sharing identity, et cetera. And one hiccup in that could really derail all the progress, you know. So that's a really tough part.
Yeah, you know, when I was reading the study, I was thinking about that and thinking about greater intractable conflicts that, you know, we see. And they like I mentioned, after the first activity of this positive kind of meaningful common goal contact, they still got into a food fight afterwards. And, that food fight could be equated in intractable conflicts as like real violence. And that's where you're right. That's where it makes it very difficult, because those things do happen, as you can see in this study, but they can be on a much more horrible scale.
Yeah, man, we're so quick to default to our group mindset, to our, in-group, out-group bias.
Yeah, but it is really fascinating, and it did give us a lot of, good things to look more into. So I'm glad, someone got to do it at some point. But
yeah,
I think you're totally right. Even as a parent, I don't know if I'd want, if someone asked me to subject my son to to a social experiment, I don't know that I'd say yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, did they ask the parents, or did they just do? I mean, because back then there was like no IRB probably, right? So they didn't need to. They had no human subjects research committee. They just do whatever the hell they want. When was that? When was the Belmont Report? Do you know the Belmont Report was the first kind of thing towards getting an IRB. 1970. So not until 1976 did they actually have like an ethical sort of report on, like ethics in human subject research that actually led to institutional review boards. So all that time, years of just psychologists could do whatever the heck they wanted. Too bad we don't live there. We could just do whatever the heck we want.